This is Black, Alabama, Geneva County, about 6 miles or so north of the Florida state line. It's between and slightly south of the towns of Hartford and Geneva. Here on September 26, 1907, a son, their fourth child, was born to William Lehman and Rebecca Irene Burke. They named him Willie Calvin. William was born in Coffee County, just north and a little west of here, and Rebecca was born south of the Florida line in Holmes County. Where the two met and married is not recorded by oral or written history, but they now rest side by side in the little Tema Cemetery near Bushville, Florida. Willie spent his young years working in cotton fields such as these and fishing in the rivers around the areas he lived. In 1923, when he was 15 years old, his mother signed a paper giving him permission to work here at the Opp Cotton Mill. Forgotten places. It was a harsh life in this area of our country, a meager existence brought about by constant hard work and sometimes sleepless nights. He's walked many miles on these dirt, red clay roads as a young boy to go fishing, to visit friends, and just sometimes to be alone with his thoughts. In 1926, he worked here on the Conecuh River clearing swampland, wading mud and water, cutting timber, then stacking and burning the brush in large bonfires. He was paid $2.20 for a 10-hour day. In 1927, he worked here at the Gant Dam, pouring cement for the coffer dams, balancing a wheelbarrow filled with cement on a walkway with only the river below. Late in 1930, Willie met a beautiful young girl named Bertie Jackson at a little church in Antioch, Alabama. The building is no longer there, but the memories of those years lie warm and safe within his heart. Then here in this house on January 24th, 1931, they were united in marriage by Grady Adams, Justice of the Peace. The newly married couple lived in a 3-room house somewhere in this small clearing where he sharecropped for a man named Jody Maynard for one season.
This is approximately the spot where the house sat, right in here. And we used to do a lot of fishing on a little creek right below the house down here.
From this place, they moved to Jay, Florida.
Tell me what your earliest memory is. Back when you were just real little, what is the first thing you can remember?
Oh, I remember a lot of things when I was real little. But one, I remember me learning my dad to love bananas. He wouldn't eat a banana. And they bought a stem of bananas, and I was wanting to eat one, and because he wouldn't taste of it, I wouldn't eat it. And I got him to taste of it, and then he could never fill up on bananas. He loved them better than anything in the world after that. And,
About how old were
I
you?
was about 2 years old.
You can remember that?
Yeah, I remember. And another thing I remember when I was just a little older, I was about 3 years old. My dad gave me a drink of a mixed drink, like out of a bottle. And I take the mixed drink, and I liked it pretty good, whiskey and whatever mix he put in. So they went out in the yard, and I saw a bottle sitting over there by the kitchen door. And I walked over and got that bottle and taken it. They had pine straw and things in it and an old cork float, and I wasn't old enough to know what it was for. And I pulled that stopper out of the bottle and turned up and drank it, and it was kerosene. And I passed out, and they thought I was going to die. They carried me up and down the road and gave me different medicines, home remedies, till I got over it. But I drank that kerosene, thought it was the bottle of whiskey, and I take me a good drink of it. I got awful sick. I was about 3 then. We lived over by Opp at that time.
Do you remember, were you born in that area? I mean, you moved out of Black too early to remember?
I moved out of Black too early to remember, but we moved to Sanford. And we were just the other side of Sanford on the Odom place. And that's where I learned my dad to eat the bananas.
Uh-huh.
And we left Sanford and moved into Opp. And I stayed around Opp till I was about 4 years old. Then we come over here to the Henderson place by Cedar Grove over there. And that's where I got acquainted with all the Hendersons.
Do you remember seeing your first car?
Yeah, I remember seeing the first car. The first car we had, I was almost 4 years old, and I had a dog, and that dog would watch me. You could send me out in the woods, and he would go with me and watch me, wouldn't let a cow get to me. And we were playing in the road one day, and the car come over the hill, and we ran in the yard, and the dog had went to sleep for a little while, and when he waked up, he seen that car, and that's the first thing he caught. He caught the front wheel of that car. And when it throwed him loose, he caught the back wheel and throwed him loose. And believe it or not, that dog come in and shook hands with us. And walked outside and died.
Huh, he's protecting you, huh?
He was,
What about Grandma? Do you remember, what your earliest memories of Grandma?
yeah, I remember my grandma. She was out there in the yard one day, and we were playing run around. That's when I was about almost 3 years old. And I stepped on a nail, and it come through my foot and stuck out on the top. And she run to me and grabbed me the best she could. She had a stroke, and she was shaking. And she picked me and the board up. And she saw the board was hung to my foot, and she put her foot on it and pulled me loose from that nail. And take me in the house and poured kerosene on it. That's what we doctored sores with then, or when you stick a nail in your foot, we'd pour kerosene on it.
Did she live with you?
And then she lived with us. And I remember she would mix up cornbread and buttermilk in a pan and put it down on the floor and give us boys a big spoon, and we'd lay down there and eat that buttermilk and cornbread.
Oh, I guess that's where Hosey gets it, huh?
And we really loved that. But she used to look after us and feed us like that. I know one time when I was about 3.5 years old, I learned to grunt like a pig. And I was out on the porch. She was cooking in the kitchen, and I started grunting in a churn like a pig. And she said, "All them hogs are back in the yard again." And she walked out and went all the way around the house looking. And then she caught me a grunting in that churn, and she gave me a paddling for that.
What about your grandfather? Do you remember?
No, he died before I was born.
Okay. What was your first job?
Huh?
What was your first job?
For pay, I worked hard all of my life on the farm.
What
And
pay?
cut corn stalks for people, and they would pay me for it, or pick beans and things and cotton in the field. But the first regular job I had was sawing logs back in 1922 for J. Johns. I worked at the lumber mill a while and started sawing logs. Worked with him off and on for about 3 years, sawing logs and working in the lumber mill.
Did you quit school before then?
Yeah, I quit school in 22. And that's when I went to Jay's and went to work after I quit school. I was going to school here at Antioch in 1922. I quit.
Well, but how and when did you first meet Mama? My mama.
We was over here by Antioch Church, and her and Bessie Biggs was there together, and I knew Bessie Biggs real well. So I walked up and spoke to them, and they was fixing to go home, walking, and I walked with both of them over to the crossroads there close to the Helms place, and instead of me going home with Bessie Biggs, I walked home with Bertie. And that's the first time going from church I met her.
How long after you first met her before you knew you wanted to marry her?
Must have been over a year. I don't remember what year that was I met her there at the church, but seems it was about a year and a half before we got married.
Because Grandma thought she was too young?
Huh?
Is that because Grandma thought she was too young to marry?
Yeah, she thought she was too young to get married. She said she was too young and wanted to wait a while. I said, well, I'll take a trip out to California. And maybe she said, I don't want you to go to California. And then she said, when she told me she'd marry me, because I was fixing to go to California. And she knows how bad I was to ramble and go. If I made up my mind to go someplace, I would usually go.
I'm kind of afraid you wouldn't come back, huh?
Afraid I wouldn't come back if I went to California.
Can you remember your wedding day?
Yeah, I remember the wedding day. And I had bought her a nice dress, a nice pair of shoes. And she said it was the prettiest dress she ever had, She had a nice dress, nice high-heel shoes when we got married. But the only thing, we got married on Saturday. And then I left Monday to go over to the job where I was going to farm, and I left her mother's till Wednesday. So I left her real quick. Married on Saturday and left her early Monday morning.
Goodness.
Then I went back and picked her up on Wednesday. Got the guy to bring me back over on the car, picked her and her clothes up. So we stayed pretty close together the rest of the time.
Can you remember what you were doing, and can you tell me any kind of memories you have on the day Hosey was born?
Well, I was thrilled when he was born, but I was living in a little stress at that time, and it worried me, but I remember well when Hosey was born, and then I'd taken the clothes, things after he was born. I'd take the clothes out the well and started to wash them, and my mother-in-law wouldn't wash them. My mother come out there, she said, put them clothes down, you ain't gonna wash them. So my mother washed the clothes.
Did you see him right away?
Oh yeah, I saw him right away.
Okay, what about Clyde? Remember the day he was
Yeah, I
born?
remember when Clyde was born. He was born over by Red Level. We lived in an old house, log home. We lived in an old log house, and I remember well when he was born. Another midwife, we didn't have doctors. But now when Winnie was born, we had doctors there and a nurse too, because she had a pretty hard time when Winnie was born.
I got ahead of myself. How did you pick Hosey's name? How did you name him?
I had a friend here that I knew for years, Hosey Mott, and I liked him pretty well. And the name just stuck to me,
Mm-hmm.
His name was M-O-T-T, Mott, Hosey Mott.
Okay, so he was named after a friend.
Uh,
What about Clyde's name? Where did you get his?
I don't know, I just, it's a name I always liked, and named him more or less after me,
Yeah.
really. And the name Clyde, but I like that name.
And what about Winnie's name? Where did you get Winnie's name?
Out of a comic book.
A comic book?
Yeah.
Weren't you lucky?
Winnie Winkle. I'll always like Winnie Winkle. I read it. and I like that name Winnie.
So, okay. What about the day the twins were born?
Well, we had a lot of trouble then. Didn't have no car to go get the doctor. We didn't have a telephone, so I went into town to call the doctor. And but then I walked back to the house. The doctor was there. But I remember when they were born. But little Dolly only lived about 18 hours. They were premature, you know. And
How did
Yep.
you pick their names?
just twins, and it come to mind. I always liked the name Bobby, and the names sound good to me, Bobby and Dolly. I just thought the names out. So they were twins, and Bobby and Dolly was pretty good names for it.
Okay, what about the day Harold was born? Do you remember that one?
Yeah, I remember when Harold was born, but that one was another one, kind of a hard luck story. We had a little trouble getting in. I believe it was a midwife, getting a midwife there. And then we had to call the doctor. And we called the doctor in when he was born. Dr. Terry from Center Hill. I believe that was his name. Dr. Terry or Perry.
How did you get his name?
Just thought of it, Harold. I liked the name Harold. I had heard it. A lot of people was named Harold. And I just liked that name.
So he wasn't named after anybody, you just liked the name. What about Ann? Do you remember the day Ann was born? What about the Clayford part of Harold's name? What about the Clayford part of Harold's name? How did you get that?
Well, I don't really understand why. There was somebody with a name, Clayford somebody, but it just seemed like it rhymed with his name.
It seemed like they went together, huh? What about the day Ann was born? You remember now? She was the first one born in the hospital?
She was born in the hospital in Wisconsin.
Do you remember the day she was born? Were you more relieved that Mama was in a hospital than one of all the other ones?
Yeah, it made me feel better. They should have better treatment in the hospital.
How did you come up with
But-
Ann? Go ahead.
No, Ann was named some nurse, I believe, or doctor. No, that was Ruth.
Ruth. Well,
we
of
just-
course you got the Birdie from Mama. But
Birdie from
Was
her
it-
mom, you know, and Ann. I always liked the name Ann.
No, that wasn't from Mama's mother. Wasn't her name Martha Ann?
Well-
You just didn't name it from that. It's that you like the name Ann.
I liked the name Ann.
Okay. What about the day Eddie was born?
That was the worst trouble we had. We come from Florida, and he was pretty near born on the road. I put her on a roadside table a couple of times for her to rest, and she was suffering before we got to Zion. We left Florida and drove all the way to Zion, and she was sick right after we started. But then we got up in northern Alabama. She got sick, and she was sick all the way. And we got to my sister's there in Zion, and she couldn't go to sleep. She really got bad. And we'd already talked to Mrs. What was that lady's name now? I know her, the midwife.
Winnie? Lloyd?
Lloyd, Mrs. Lloyd. So I rushed over to Mrs. Lloyd's there in Zion, and she was a midwife, you know, and he was born there at Mrs. Lloyd's in Zion.
How'd you pick his name?
More or less, I voted for Thomas E. Dewey, and his name is Edward Dewey.
Edward Dewey.
And I liked, I had a nephew, Edward Friedel, and I liked him. and Edward Friedel, and then Thomas E. Dewey come to my mind, because I voted for Dewey years ago.
So he was named after Thomas E. Dewey, huh? That's where you got the Edward Dewey. What about the day Ruth was born?
Well, we had an ordeal then. That's the time Hosey got hurt. The tractor turned over on him. And when he got home, he was broke up and skin up pretty bad. And Bertie got frightened, had a lot of stress, and we had to rush her to the hospital. So then Hosey was there hurt, and then Ruth had to go in the hospital. And she was worried so bad till Ruth was part of the way born. And then they tried to take her with forceps and things, and they couldn't take Ruth. So they had to put her back in this body and have cesarean operation. So I had awful hard time.
Now Ruth was born, named from your aunt?
No, Ruth was named Dr. Kappa's wife was named Ruth.
Oh, okay.
And that's where they got from Dr. Kappa's wife. And
And the Glen Dean was...
you know, there's a story behind that too. She was in such a bad shape. The doctor told me, I wouldn't give the name of the doctor, but he told me that didn't think the baby would ever live, and said she's in such a bad shape. And he said, Mom is sick, and said, we're going to try to save her. But he said, I could give the baby a shot, so you got a big bunch of kids anyway. And she would just go out easy. I said, no, I want my baby, regardless of its condition. And I kept Ruth with my request.
And she was worth it, huh?
She was worth it.
Okay, what about the day I was born?
Huh?
What about the day I was born? Remember that?
Yeah, I remember you were born in the hospital. You too was sincere, because he wouldn't take the chance with her going like he did with Ruth.
Now you didn't name me, did you? I was the only one out of them that you didn't name, right? Mama and Ruth named me.
Yeah, I didn't name you, but it's a beautiful name.
Yeah, it is.
I was well pleased with it.
Would you have picked the name for me if I would have been a boy?
I might have.
Mama always said that I was going to be named Fred if I was a boy. I was wondering if you'd pick that one out.
Fred,
Yeah, that's what Mama always told me.
my superintendent, Fred Payline.
Okay, that's who I was going to be named after if I was a boy. Okay, now you have a lot of inventions. What was your favorite one out of all of them? What was the one you think was the best idea?
I believe the Finnish baby diaper was the best one. But then I did like that litter compactor too. And then I had a game called Vacation. You shake, dice, and move. I liked that because it was a map of the United States, and the roads run through each state to the different points of interest for that state. And you would shake the dice and move how many dots was on the dice. But in this game, it had detours, where if you hit detour, then you had to come way back and get behind everybody. And then it had service station, which would cost you some of your money. And the object was to see if you could go to vacation through the United States with the money that you was allotted to take your vacation with. And I liked that.
Oh, very good. You didn't that one didn't go far? Did you try to get that
I
one?
didn't try to sell it.
You didn't try to sell it, okay. That's what I was wondering. How did you think of it? It just came to you?
Just came to me.
Was it kind of like a night type thing, or was it just something you thought about all over a long period of time?
Well, now the game was just something I thought of. But them Finnish baby diapers, Ruth was almost the cause of me getting that patent. Because Bertie had her on her leg, and she pretty near fell off, and she grabbed her to catch her and cut her with a pin, safety pin, cut her on the leg. And just like snapping your finger, I think then the safety pin should be done away with. And I invented, just like snapping your finger, I invented the diaper with snap fasteners on it instead of safety pins.
That one did the best of all your inventions, didn't it?
If I would have had the money to go into that, I think I could have been a millionaire today.
It would have been nice, huh?
Because I wanted to make children's clothing, little children's clothing, along with that diaper, and then make children's clothing. And I bought that lot up there, 2 lots, and I was going to put a factory on it. And I wished that I'd went ahead and put the factory on it and started. But I had no money. I had a big bunch of kids and had to feed them. And I didn't have no money, and that's why I didn't.
Mm-hmm.
I had bought the lot to put the factory on, but by spending the money for the lot, then I asked a guy about building the factory, and if he would have built the factory, that alone, just the building, small building, would have cost me $38,000 at that time if I didn't have that type of money. I wasn't able to do it.
Mm-hmm. Okay, you belong to the Burlington Liars Club. How did you get into the Burlington Liars Club?
Well, I heard of the Burlington Liars Club, and I've always been a big liar anyway, all my life. And I wondered how I could get into the Burlington Liars Club, so I sent them a couple of lies. And they acknowledged one of them, but they didn't give me a card. But then when I told them about my horse, and I trained that horse perfect, he'd do anything you told him to do. And I was guarding cattle out in Texas, and when you got a bunch of cows and they start to stampede, all them cows will follow the leader and go off. And them cows was going towards a cliff, 100 foot straight down. And I told my horse, I said, head them cows off. And he run, and he headed the cows off, and he turned them just before they run off the cliff. But he ran off, 100 foot right straight down. And me and him both was falling down. But he was so good to mine, just before he hit the dirt, I hollered, whoa, and he stopped in midair. It hurt neither one of them. So they let me have a Liars Club card with that.
That one was the one, huh?
Yeah, that's the one.
Well, that's good. Did you ever send any more after that, or did
Oh,
that
I
one?
sent a lot of them,
Did
but I
you?
never got, just got honorable mention a couple of times.
Uh-huh. When did you retire, and what did you do after you retired?
I retired in 1967. I was 60 years old. And they had a point system, and I had my points in. The length of service with a company and your age. And I had 25 years, and I was 60 years old, which made 85. And I retired. That's when I went to Florida and bought that piece of land with the orange grove on it. And I didn't retire. I went to work when I bought that orange grove. So then I worked on that for 15 years with the orange grove and growing vegetables in Groveland, Florida.
Did you like all the places that you've lived?
Yeah, I was satisfied.
Which was your
If I could have had a home up in Wisconsin, of course I eventually built me one. But I couldn't rent a home when I went up there because I had children. And they wouldn't rent you a house if you had children. And I had to live in places I didn't want to live with my kids because I couldn't rent a house.
How did you finally get a piece of property? What was that man's name?
I had just a little bit of money, but I didn't have enough to pay down on that piece of property. And that friend of mine there in Kenosha let me have $900 to finish paying the payment on that place. And Mr. New, he was a real estate man. I bought it through him, and he lent me $900. And I had my money transferred from Florida up there, and I bought that piece of land. Then I tried to convert that old house into a little bigger house for the kids to make it better for them. But it wasn't a good home. And then I converted the garage into another house because I had a friend that wanted to move into the garage. But I added another room on and put a bathroom into the garage. and let them move into the garage. And then I started digging a basement by hand, and I almost had the basement done, but a guy come by and said he'd take his machine and dig the basement and dig the trench out to the street for the sewer. We'll hook the sewer and water to it. So I hired him to do that. Then I built that brick home, and that was the first nice home that I ever had. Had a decent place in for the kids.
So is there any other memories you can think of you'd like to talk about?
No, not too much, I don't think. It's a lot of good memories in life with the kids. And I done a lot of traveling. That was one good memory. We traveled, I've been all the way from Key West, Florida to Canadian border, and all the way from New York City to San Diego, California. So I've been across the state, the United States, in both directions.
A lot of them miles with Harold and Judy.
Yeah, we enjoyed a lot of them miles. You know, you and Ruth was with me when I went up to Minnesota. We was almost to Canadian border then.
Yeah.
When we went on that ride and we crossed the river in Wisconsin, went up to Minnesota and come back and went down to Iowa. And then we come back from Iowa and come back up to that place there in Wisconsin, to the Dells in Wisconsin.
And you and Mama were by yourself when you went down to the end in Key West, huh?
We were by ourselves when we went to Key West.
So you've been from one end to the other.
Yeah, we went from the last street to the Canadian border. And then we've been New York City and Oxnard, California, and San Diego. So that was crossing it this way, across the United States.
You still like to travel, don't you?
I still like to travel. Been to Carlsbad Caverns and Grand Canyon and all them things out there we've seen.
What about some of your jobs that you had before you married Mama, like in Ohio and stuff? Did you like it up in there?
Well, the best job I had was work at Nash Motors in Wisconsin in 1929. That's a job I liked better than any job I ever had. But in 1927, I went up to Zion and went to work at the building industry up there. I went to American Motors, but they wasn't hiring at that time. So in 29, when I went up there, I got in there when they were hiring, and they hired me in 29. And I stayed there till the crash of the stock market. They closed the factory up, so I was laid off. And then I came home and stayed about 3 or 4 days and went to Akron, Ohio. Me and Clement Adams and Harold Stewart. And I stayed up there, and I got a job with the Barberton Water Department. Barberton is a suburb of Akron, just almost like one town. But I lived in Barberton, and I went to work with the Barberton Water Department, and I liked that real good. I wish I would have stayed, but it got too cold for me on the outside. I left there the 12th of December and went to Frostproof, Florida. So I done quite a lot of running around when I was young, and then I still traveled quite a lot after I got married. And I still like to travel. We was out there in California 2 years ago, well, a little over a year ago, after Mom died. I still went back to California. And I would advise any young person to try to travel while they're young. Don't wait to get old. You've got the desire you want to go and travel some, because I waited too long.
Yeah, but usually when you have the time, you don't have the money, and when you have the money, then you don't have the time when you're younger. You gotta work, and you don't get time off for a while.
That's right. Well, like me, I had a big bunch of kids. I had to feed them and never could get enough money to go no place.
Of course, we went to Florida.
Only we made about 10, 15 trips to Florida and back. So we run down there and back, but it wasn't a good vacation. It was just to go someplace.
Just to visit family. Dude, what about your early memories of you and Mama together, you first married?
lot of work and a lot of trouble. Her folks didn't like me at all. And we had trouble with her folks, and her folks lived with us, or we lived with them for a while. And they got to where they couldn't get a house to move in, and I give them half of my house to live in till they could find a place. But they still didn't like me.
Well, you got along with Uncle Marvin pretty good, didn't you? Didn't you have a double wedding with him?
We had double wedding with Marvin, but I had a little trouble with Marvin. Not too much, but he just jumped up on the table one time. We had a little argument there, me and his mother and all of them. His mother reached over to pinch Bertie. I said, "Don't pinch her." I said, "She's mine now." And Marvin jumped up on the table. He says, "You can't be cussing my mother like that." I just told him, I just dropped my hand down. I says, "Come on around." I said, "This is what I've always wanted. I'll fix you up." So he sat down and started eating his breakfast. Never had no more trouble with him. So I was pushed till I got overbearing.
What about your school years? Do you remember stuff in your school years when you were going to school?
Had a hard time trying to go to school. Different places. Stayed with my dad till I was 10 years old. I had to fix my own lunch, cook my own food, clean my own house, and go to school and then try to prepare food for my dad. And I done that till I was 10 years old. And I ran away from my dad and went to my mother and went to school here at Antioch. But still, I stayed with my stepdad's folks some because I couldn't get along with him. And I only stayed there 4 years with all of them, and I left home when I was 14. Come here when I was 10 and 14, I left home.
What about during the Depression? How did you do there at that time? Can you remember when the stock market crashed?
Oh yeah, I remember when the stock market crashed. They taken people's farms, and there in 1931, when I made that crop over on Judah Maynard Place. They come out, the Federal Land Bank put a garnishment on that farm that I made. I didn't owe nobody a dime. And they come out there and they gathered my cotton, corn, and peanuts, sold it to pay that guy's rent. I didn't get nothing out of it. So that was starting of the crash of the stock market and the Depression, the bad part of the Depression. So I worked with some people for a while for 50 cents a day. Then I started sharecropping, and I couldn't live on 50 cents a day. So I left here and went to Bushnell, Florida, and went to work for $1 a day. So $1 a day, at least I doubled my pay. With a bunch of kids, what are you going to do with $1 a day? You can't even buy them clothes. So I got out and I pulled moss, I cut wood for people, and I done everything to get a few dollars to try to supply food for my kids. And I stayed down there in Florida then after I left Alabama here. That was just after Winnie was born. I went to Bushnell, Florida, and I stayed down there about 7 years doing different jobs, working at the Cumber Cypress Company and farming and working at a dairy. Then worked with a railroad company. 7 years later, in '43, I went back to Zion, Illinois. I went back to the automobile factory. And that was the best move I ever made. So that's about my life's history.
Yeah, had a good long one, huh? So what, of all the presidents that there've been since you were, during your lifetime, who do you think's done the best job?
Harry Truman, and I didn't vote for him. I voted for Thomas E. Dewey. Harry Truman done a pretty good job, although he dropped the atomic bomb, and I didn't go for that much. But he done some things I didn't like. But as far as the country, he done a lot of good things for the country. But when he fired MacArthur, I wrote him a dirty letter. And I got the nicest letter back from Truman that I ever got back in my life. And it made me kind of feel bad that I wrote him such a dirty letter and got such a nice one back from him. But you've got to give your ideas what you think is right and let them know that you don't like it. I didn't like it when they fired MacArthur because I had the same idea that MacArthur, what he done. I had that idea a month early, before MacArthur done it. And that's when he come in and went behind the guys where they were fighting. And he cut their supply line off where they couldn't supply their army. And I said if he'd cut them supply line and then send the army north and one south, you'd get the war over in a hurry. Well, MacArthur come in with that boat and he cut their supply line and started across the country there. And Truman fired him for doing that. Made him pull it back, take his boat back and everything. And wouldn't let him do that. And that was halfway. I had the idea when Truman had it. I mean, when MacArthur had the idea. Same thing that MacArthur done. I had the idea that it would be good, but Truman didn't like it. Well, Truman told me that why they done them things was the best interest for the country. And he was glad I had interest in my government, that I would ask questions about it. And said, we will try to answer all the questions the best we can. And for our opinion, that was the best thing to do at that time, because you could have caused trouble in other countries would have come in fighting us, you know. If we'd have cut that line, China and all the rest of them might have come in. And he explained to me why he done it, you know. He sent me a nice letter, but I wrote him a letter. I told him we elected you to lead us and not mislead us. We elected you to guide us and not misguide us. We gave you the reins to ride. If you can't ride decent, dismount at once. And that's the letter I wrote to him. But he sent me a nice letter, made me feel bad.
So you were too young to join for World War One.
Too young for World War One, and then when the next war started, I had about 5 kids and they wouldn't let me get in. I tried to enlist, but in World War One, when that was over, and I got old enough to go, I tried to enlist. And at that time, you had to have a high school education to enlist in the Army or Navy. So then I got married, and before the other war started, I had 5 kids, and was working in that factory where they were making airplanes. And they said I was doing my part anyway. I was working in an airplane factory, but said we can't take you in, can't accept you because you've got too many kids. Had 5 kids.
But you thought of things. I mean, you wrote letters to, and you even invented something for them.
I sent them a lot of ideas that they were working with, the landing craft, to land the guys where they wouldn't have to stop in the water and jump out. They could go on to shore without being shot down in the water. They go on the shore and get behind something with armored plate steel in the front of it, where the regular rifles wouldn't shoot through it. And they'd get out at land where they could spread out and get some kind of cover and wouldn't have to be shot down in the water. And they were experimenting with that. I don't know what, maybe they come up with that amphibious jeep with it, I mean. And then another one I sent in to when they were having trouble over there, I sent them a couple of ideas. Just drop a bomb with flaming gases. When the bomb hit, everybody fall flat. And as soon as the bomb burst, they jump up and start running. But in the inside of that had little fragmentation bombs that would be fired from the flash of that bomb, and it would throw them in all directions. Then when the guys get up to start to run, it would throw shrapnel in all directions, cut them down. And then they had one, they couldn't get on that mountain over in Korea. They would shoot our guys down there. They'd pull their guns back in the gun emplacements, and they'd come to the edge and they could shoot our guys, but we couldn't get them off because they had their guns buried on that hill. And they said they had to put their guys around that hill because if they tried to send them up there, they'd all get killed anyway. And you couldn't take that hill. So I sent them my idea how to take the hill. I said, take a airplane and go over it and spray gas on it and set it afire with tracer bullets, and that would get all of they sent me a letter back, Mr. Burke, your idea will work, but it's too cruel and inhuman to think about. Thank you. That's all they said. But you know what they started doing a year after that? Burning guys out of holes with a flamethrower. What difference would it been to burn them out of that mountain with that flames if they're going to burn them out of the hole with a flamethrower? Would have been the same thing. Of course, they would have got all of them. Everybody that was on that mountain would have been done. Because the gas went there and they cut all their oxygen off with the smoke and the flames. What it didn't burn up, they'd kill them anyway. There was no way for nobody to surrender on that mountain. What I wanted to do, just saturate it with that fuel oil or with gasoline and set the penetration button. That would have been cruel.
Yeah, for sure.
But how cruel was it to burn them out of the foxhole?
Well, whatever you can think of. Just talk about your life and your memories, any kind of memory that you can think of that comes to mind.
I didn't have too many good memories.
It may not be good, but I bet you got a lot of memories.
Yeah, I had a lot of sad times, lonesome times. I've been walking down the road and walked right out in the woods and sat down on a log, listened to the birds sing right by myself and sat there for hours at the time. And like that time, I hadn't seen my folks in quite a while, and I was coming up the road right the other side of Grady Adams, and they lived in a house down by the farm near the sheriff place down over the hill, but I could see them from the road. And I sat down by the road, smoked a cigarette, and watching them work around the barn, the yard, and everything. Got up and, well, I hadn't seen them in quite a while, but I sat there and watched them, and they don't know I was watching them. Just didn't have no desire to go down there.
How old was Aunt Jessie when she left home? Do you remember that?
Yeah, she left in the, I believe it was 23. She was born in 2. Now they claim she was born in 1900, but they always told me she was born in 2. And then she got married and left in 23, but she was like me, she didn't stay home a lot. There was an old guy down here at Sanford, his wife was in a wheelchair, and Jessie went over to cook for her and to roll around in the wheelchair and take care of her. And that old man paid her some, but he didn't do much more than just feed her and buy her some clothes to look after his wife. And one more place she went and stayed for a while. Of course, now, like I say, I wasn't with them too much over. She left and stayed with Mom and John. And then they come and got George when we lived over at the Henderson place. They come and got George to go to school with Jessie, where she'd had somebody go to school with her and to be with her. And me and Homer stayed with my dad. And we lived in that old house down below where I get my hair cut now. We stayed there in 1913, and I believe it was there in 14. And the last of 14 or 15, we moved up there in the road where I told you we got our head in the crack of the fence. We lived there, and then Homer left there and come and stayed with Mom and John. But I stayed with my dad. I stayed with him 2 years after that. In 1917, I believe, is when I left my dad and come over here to Antioch in 17. And that would have put me 10 years old, born in 7. And when I was 14, I left home, so I was only with them 4 years. And part of that time I was with Bill back, going with Bill's kids to school across the creek. They were afraid to go and afraid of snakes and everything. I went over and stayed with him to walk them kids to school. So I didn't even stay with Mom and John 4 years, maybe 3 years. Then I left. And then 25, I left here and went to Winter Garden, Florida. Come back, I come straight and went to work at this swamp over here in 26. When the vegetables over in 25, I come over here to this swamp, started helping clean that up, and worked there till 1927 on the dam. And all the guys cleaning the swamp up come there. They asked for volunteers over there at that bridge, you know. You went with me over that bridge there where Cottle Creek and the river come together. They asked for volunteers there off of the swamp to go to the dam to work on the dam. So I went down and worked on the dam there last part of 26 and until 27. Then when all the guys got down there on both sides, there was so many people, I told the boss, I said, you got plenty of help now. I said, I think I'm going to leave you and go. And I left there and went to Illinois.
Is that where Aunt Jessie was at the time? Is that why you picked Illinois?
I guess so. I went up there, but I didn't stay at Jessie's too much. I stayed there for a while. You know, the big home where they got that thing off of it now and got it sitting there?
Yeah,
It was a big design apartment building. I stayed there for quite a while. And then the place opened up down below the cemetery next to the building industry over there. They had another apartment building down there, so I left the Zion home and I went down and stayed in that building. Then Mama was staying with Jessie for a while, but there's something you just couldn't get along like you wanted to. Well, they had a big family too. And then Mama come down there to that apartment building and got her a room. She worked in the bakery and it was closer for her to go to the bakery. You know, it was closer for me to go to the building industry. It was close by there. So I stayed in that apartment. I didn't stay at Jessie's too much. Then I went back in 29, stayed there for a while, and me and Homer stayed for a while, but then I got me another boarding place. I guess I had an unsettled mind or something. Wasn't satisfied nowhere too much.
Just like to travel, I think. See the countryside.
I get lonesome too. You didn't have no place to, it's like I used to say, you didn't have no place to hang your hat, you know. Wherever you hung your hat was home. And I just roamed a lot. Went a lot of places and couldn't be satisfied nowhere. Left there in 29, I worked at Nash Motors. Got laid off there, come home a little while, went to Akron, Ohio. Worked with the Barberton Water Department and left there December 12th, went straight to Frostproof, Florida, picking fruit, El Maxi Fruit Company. I worked 3 winters down there at Frostproof. But if you ever heard of a little poor guy that didn't have a dime or rambling, I was one of the guys that rambled a lot.
Did you ever catch trains like they show in the movies?
I've caught a lot of trains. I've rode some, buy me a ticket and go on them, but I've caught a lot of them on the blinds, you know, ride the blinds. We was on one time, Mr. Heaton got on here in Andalusia, and we went to Greenville. Is that Greenville, Evergreen over there? Evergreen. And that train was going in the opposite direction. We wanted to go to Jay, Florida. So we had to change trains there. So we got off. And the first train I seen coming, I knew him, I'd rode him before, was a passenger train. So I got with Mr. Heaton, and he'd never rode trains like that. I got with him just before the train got there. I said, now this one, you got to catch it before it stops. Because when it stops and starts off, they're all going to be looking back to see if somebody catch it. Because this is a passenger train. So when the first car passed, I said, you get there. He says, where? I stand on that little bar about as big as your thumb, you know, and hold the other, standing between them cars. So I caught the next one before it stopped, you know, while it was still rolling, and I got up on it. He says, is that the only place you got to ride on this thing? I said, yeah. I said, it ain't very far. Here, you go ahead. So I'm going to ride that thing. He wouldn't go, so we had to get out, and I thumbed ride on the truck to go down to Jay. He wouldn't ride that train. He didn't like that idea because you stand on a rod about as big as your thumb holding another one up there, and that thing a bouncing and twisting. You couldn't get over that heat on it. Homer's another one didn't like riding. He said, "You better quit riding these things." I said, "Man, I've been all over the country and from there. Just got to be, you got to be wide awake and stay awake. You can't go to sleep, because that's the only place you got to ride." Now I caught one that caught behind the baggage car, the mail car, here in Andalusia, and I got off it up. But of course, you're standing between them, holding that little rod, and my hand was just as smoke as a bee. And the police walked up to me just as I got off and up. He said, "Were you on that train?" I said, "No, I just run back and see if a wife and kids was on it." But I didn't have no wife. If he'd looked at my hands, he would know that I was riding because holding that thing, and they burned coal at that time. You were just as smoky as you could be. But when he asked me if I rode that passenger train in there, they'd have thrown me in the lockup if I'd rode that passenger train in, but I did. But he didn't know what I told him. I went down to see if wife and kids were on the train. Okay, he said, "If I catch you riding them," he said, "you're going to get in trouble." Done a lot of things in my life that was kind of dangerous and foolish, but it was life. But ain't too many people had a life like I did. No place to stay. Didn't have no, well, I said I didn't have no home. I could have stayed if I'd wanted to put up with everything like the other kids did, I guess. But John used to beat Homer and George, and Mama would whip them a lot and for things that John done. And I just couldn't see him whipping me. He wasn't my dad, and of course I didn't stay with him too long either. And I didn't allow him to whip me. Yeah, I left when I was pretty go stay with other people part-time. I stayed at Uncle Steve's at Hartford about 3 weeks one time, splitting cordwood for old man Black. And then I stayed at Uncle Lash's about 3 weeks down there one time.
Now, is this your mother's brother?
My mother's brothers.
How many was in her family?
In her family, I believe it was 8 or 9. It was Uncle Steve, Uncle Tom, Uncle Lash, and Uncle Dave. And then there was Mary, Martha, and Ruth, and Becky Irene. That's 8 of them that I knew.
What about on your dad's side of the family? How many brothers and sisters?
He had one sister. She married Matt Gibson, and she died about a year after that in childbirth. The first child, she died, my dad's sister. He had one brother, Willie. He was crippled. His knees was bad. He couldn't walk. And then my dad wasn't too healthy. You know, he was a little guy, 105 pounds. So Willie died way back years ago, right after Granddad died. And then the grandmother come and stayed with us for a while and lived over at Op. That's where I got on the nails on that board, you know, and she picked it up. She stayed with us I guess till she died over there at Dan Houston place there in Op. And then when I was about 4 going on 5, we moved over here to George Henderson's place. There close to where I get my hair cut back this way. I think I showed you where Henderson lived. And I stayed over in there then till I was 10 years old, over at that place just above the Hendersons where he put our head in the crack of the fence. But I used to play with that Macon Henderson there at Sasser Crossroads when me and him was just 5 years old, wasn't old enough to go to school. Couldn't go to school till he was 7, you know. And me and him used to play there before we ever started school. And Cleve Henderson, though, was just he was just like a dad to us. He'd do anything for us kids. And he really got mad at my dad for putting our head in the crack of the fence. He slapped him and kicked him and told him, he said, I'm not a murdering man, Mr. Burke. He said, if I ever see him kid's head in the crack of the fence again, he said, I'm going to kill you right there. He said, you'll die right there. He said, that's the most cruel thing he'd ever seen. Just standing there with her head in the crack of the fence.
He didn't have a whole lot of patience, then, your dad?
Huh?
He didn't have a lot of patience with the kids?
No, he didn't have no patience much with us. But Cleve went over, he wouldn't turn us loose. He went over the field and got him. He kicked him and slapped him all the way over and made him turn us loose. And told him, said, if I ever see this kid, he said, you're going to die right there. And I think he would have to. Cleve didn't like that when well, a lot of people heard about it, didn't like that. He said that was too cruel and inhuman for a man to put a kid's head in the crack of the fence out there in the hot sunlight. That's cruel
What did
treatment.
he do? Do you know what he did it for?
Yeah,
What
because
was
we
it?
couldn't cut as many bushes. Had a big place of bushes and was trying to cut them. You know, we used to cut the trees down, and then the stumps would grow a lot of bushes, and we was having to break them bushes off of them stumps down where he was going to plant some corn and sweet potatoes. And it was a big place, and we didn't get done the day he told us to. So the next day, he said, you kids didn't get that done. He says, you got to take what follows. That's always was his word. You got to take what follows. Well, we figured we was going to get a whipping. So the next day, I went down and cut a few bushes, and I told Homer, I said, you finish up the bush, and I'm going to the house and mop the floors good and clean the house and have him a good dinner cooked. And I had a dinner cooked, some beans and peas and bacon fried and nice cornbread cooked. He ate a good dinner. So I got up real quick, started washing the dishes, and Homer got the broom. The floors didn't need sweeper. Homer got the broom and started sweeping the floors. And he went around and said, well, when we got about through, he said, you guys come on. And he picked up the hammer. And I looked at that pretty straight. And Homer walked on out with him. And I got way behind him. I was going to make a run for it if he hit Homer on the head with that hammer. So he went out and knocked that board off the fence and told him, lay his head, he's come on with it. Put your head down on this board. I had to put her head down on the board here, and he put the other board right here and started neck like that and got his nails nailed. Went and called his mule and went plowing in the field. Just,
How long did you stay that way?
about 2:30, Cleve Henderson come from up, and he saw us bend over by that fence. He said it looked funny. And we had a big yard kind of like this, and it was kind of a long ways up to the house. But it was fenced, you know, right up by the house, and that left a parking place, big parking place out there. So he drove his mules up to the fence there, tied the lines over the fence, and come around the house. We was at the back of the house. And you said, what in the heck are you kids doing there with your head in the crack of the fence? We told him Dad put us in there. He said, what for? I said, them bushes, we didn't get all of them cut yesterday. He said, I'll be back in a minute. He went over there and he kicked my dad's butt, slapped his face, and he told me, he says, if I ever see them kids with a head in the crack of the fence again, he said, I'm going to kill you right there.
Do you have any good memories of your dad? Or was he always mean to you?
He was all right. He read the Bible a lot. But as far as the good things, wasn't too much that he could do that was good. He's little, wasn't able to work much, never made any money working for 50 cents a day. Couldn't offer very much. I guess I stayed with him about 5 years. I run away from mother, and my dad went to my mother and stepdad for a little while when they lived over close to Rose Hill. And then I run away from them and went back to him. And I must have stayed there around 4 or 5 years. He put our head in the crack of the fence, and then Homer left, and I stayed there with him 2 years after Homer left. Stayed there till I was 10 years old. I was about 8 years old when he put our head in the crack of the fence.
So Uncle Homer went back to your mother? Is that what
Went back to home with Mom and John. He run away, slipped off from Dad, run away and went over there. my dad asked me, so where's Homer? I said, he went back to Mama's. I said, got mad because he put a head in the crack of the fence. He said, well, he said, he had it coming, is all he said. He didn't say much about it. But I stayed there for about over a year, and then he taken me over to see Mom and John one time, just take me over to see the boys, and Jesse and all of them. And then the next year we went back. And going back, he said I would stop. He said he should have known something was fixing to happen. I would stop and I'd look around, and I'd pick out a tree that I could see was in line, and this tree was taller than this one. Or if this was a broken stump, I would know it. And I was picking me out trees along the road like an Indian would do, where I knew I could come back. And after we went and visited him, I went home, and I picked out my way. The next day, Homer yelled. I lived over there the other side of Grady Adams in that field. He saw me come through the woods and stick my head up. I was just a little guy, wasn't very big. And Homer yelled, "There's Willie." George says, "Where?" He says, "Up there in the edge of the wood." And they come running up there. And I had walked all the way from over to George Henderson place, or there by Cleve Henderson place. And I had walked over here to this place. Coming through that river swamp over there, seen a big snake about that big, and I kept throwing sand on him, and I made him crawl down to the river where I could get on the bridge and get across. Mm. But could you see a 10-year-old kid doing that now? Mm-mm. Him just a little guy. But I come all that distance over by myself, walking through the woods part of the time, down the road part of the time. I was always glad to get in the woods because I knew he couldn't send somebody after me on a horse or something, catch me. I'd go the pathway through the woods.
How did he wind up having you stay with him instead of you being with your mother? They just take?
They just agreed to let him, if wherever we wanted to stay. But when we run away from him and go to Mama, we got a whipping one time. We went to see her. Just spent the day with her and got a whipping when we got back. But if we wanted to stay, well, we'd just run away and go. But if we wanted to go stay with him, we'd just head back. Like a bunch of loose hogs, you might say. We'd go stay where we wanted to. And I done that since I was 5 years old, till I was 10, and then I left home when I was 14. You never seen a kid have a life like I had.
What kind of work did you do at American Motors? What did you start out doing? What was your first job?
My first job was for Nash Motors, and I worked there in 29. I was final finisher and inspector on the sheet metal, on the convertible bodies. I had to inspect the entire body before it went to the paint shop. Couldn't have any dents on it. The doors had to have the right opening and everything. But I was the sheet metal inspector before they went to the paint shop on the convertible body. And when I went back to American Motors, I went to work on a washing machine, washing parts, but I only stayed on there a week. And then they had a machine, they wanted to break somebody in to run the machine. And I started running that machine. And then they wanted somebody on the dynamic balance machine. I think they were trying me out. They got me to go on that balance machine, and that's when I got the idea. And they sent for the guy from the company, Pratt and Whitney Company, to see what I was doing on balancing them supercharger fan. See, they had fan on them like this, but the body of the thing was solid, and then they had fans over here to pick up the gas, the air to pump the gas through. And you had to cut some of them fans like that, or you had to cut them here. If it was static balance, going this way, bouncing like, you had to cut in here. The dynamic balance, that's a wobble like this. You had to cut it here to where it would run smooth, because you couldn't have no vibration in there. And some of them fins had broke off in the airplanes. They got so thin cutting them, they broke off. And about a week after I started, I got in here, and instead of cutting these fins, I got 1 degree ahead of that, and instead of cutting them scallops flat like this, like between your fingers, I turned it down like this, and I cut down this way, so I was cutting metal off of this side and in the center. So I was correcting it statically and dynamically by cutting in the fence. And when the guy got there from Pratt & Whitney, he said it won't work. Paylighter said, you better go out there and let him show you. Say he's doing something. Said, we don't know what he's doing, but he says it's working. Went out there, and I told him what I was doing. He says, that ain't gonna work. So I put one on a dynamic balance machine, got a light on it, and it showed me where to cut it. And I got here, instead of, like I said, instead of cutting out here, I cut it at an angle down here, which I was cutting it out here, but I was cutting off of that side too. Made common horse sense to me. And I cut 7. That little guy wouldn't weigh 125 pounds. He says, mark one and let me cut it. So I put it on the machine where the light shined on it. I marked it for him. And I showed him where to cut it and how to cut it. And he cut it and scratched his head. And he says, mark me another one. So I marked another one. Now he cut 4 before he would decide that would balance it dynamically and statically. Because you were taking metal off of the inside and off of here. And it worked. Put his hand on my shoulder. He said, well, I'll tell you one thing. He said, you just saved this company thousands of dollars. He said, I'm going to 7 factories now and stop them from cutting them fence. So I stayed on that dynamic balance machine for quite a while. And then another job opened up on the drill press. It paid pretty good money. A little bit more, and it was always trying to get more money. And or they were trying me out. And they put me on that job. It was the next to the highest paid job in there at that time. And I went on that drill, and I was doing that when the war was over. And but I had been on 7 different jobs, and 2 of them I made great improvements on them, and another one I made little improvements on them. About drilling a hole in one of them, and they had a little groove, like the groove in your finger here, in this shaft that went through this other shaft. And then on this one short shaft, we had the ring slinger on that thing with holes in it for the fuel oil to go through. And the guy was drilling them after I left the job. He started drilling, and I noticed he had that ring slinger, which was about as high as your finger, pretty near that high, this high anyway. And he would drill it with that on there, which was holding your shaft up. And the next one I saw him drilling, he had the ring slinger off. It was flat. I told him, I said, if you're going to drill one with a ring slinger on it, you should drill all of them like that, not one with it off and one with it on, because you ain't going to match up with that oil groove. And he was a hot-headed guy. He just turned around on his heels and he headed to the office. Went and told Fred Paylight and said, that guy out there is trying to run this place, so he's telling us how to run the jobs. I was telling how to do it to be safe. Paylight said, Burke, he said, that shaft going through there turns anyway. He said, if you don't hit that oil groove, you'll be all right because it'll get oil anyway under pressure. But that shaft that went through there was so tight you couldn't hardly turn it. It was snug. And that oil groove, like the groove here in your finger, just a little small groove, was put there for a purpose. And what I wanted to do is drill that hole where it would match this hole up where the oil went through, would match up with that groove. And Paylight told me it didn't make no difference, so I didn't say no more about it. 2 weeks later, they come back and said, wish we'd have listened to you, would have saved $350,000. Said, we're tearing down every machine, every engine that we made to see if that hole is drilled where to hit that oil groove. Said, the ones that didn't hit the oil groove, some of the engines just froze up. And now we got to tear. They had to get them off the boats and tear them down to check that oil groove. It was common horse sense that I wanted to put it over that oil groove. And they were drilled up like this, which would throw it off of the oil groove, or down flat and put it over the oil groove. Common horse sense. They wouldn't, he said they'd save $350 if they would just listen to me there in 2 weeks. All the engines they had to bring back and tear it down. Every idea that I give that company, I give them hundreds of ideas. I fixed the machine when Hosey wasn't there because Hosey said his arms got tired of pulling back on that thing, and you run the threads so deep to clean the threads out, and when it gets so far, you'd have to reverse it to get it back out. And he said his arms are hurting. I says, I'll fix that. I had never looked at the machine. Nobody had ever complained with it. I went down and I got me a big bolt about this long, and I put it through this machine. I got me a piece of metal, cut it out, put it on that bolt, and bent it out like this. And I got me a rod, and I fixed that to where that would pull the machine out like that. You know, instead of doing it with your fingers, you'd step on that thing down at the floor like that. I got a little piece of metal and put down at the floor. You step on it like that, it would pull this one, and it would pull that rod. And you didn't have to pull them with your hand. You'd step on that thing. When it goes as far as you want to, you'd step on it, and it would pull it back with that piece of metal. Bob Anderson, the boss told me to take it off and put it in a drawer, and I take it off for 2 nights, and Bob Anderson heard about it. He said, tell Burke to leave that thing on the machine that he put on to look at it. And the next week, they put it on 7 machines throughout the factory. Said it was just a foot reversal, a common horse set. Nothing to it. But you could step on that thing with your foot and pull it back instead of pulling it with your hand like that.
Were you putting it on there when Hosey got on so it wouldn't hurt his arm? Is that what you're doing?
Now, Hosey kind of liked the job after that. But you know what it done? Increased the thing 114 pieces an hour. That many more because it didn't have to pull them. That foot reverse them faster, they could work faster. 114 an hour more. Just, and every machine in that shop, look at the money that saved that company. And like that engineer come and got me, he knew that I had put a lot of improvements on the machinery in there. And he come and told Rudy Nyberg, he said, I want to take your setup man over to the setup department. He said, we got a brooch over there. And said this company, when they made the brooch, said it makes so many pieces an hour. And he says, there ain't no way in the world to make that many pieces an hour on that machine. He says, I stood there for 3 days, and the time study man has been on it for 3 days trying to figure it out. And he said, a machine won't make that many pieces an hour. He says, I want Burke to go over there and just have a look at that machine and see if he can figure out what's wrong with it. I got about as close to the machine as near the steps out there. I wasn't even to the machine. And I told the engineer, I said, I know what's wrong with your machine now. He jumped ahead of me and threw his hand up. Yeah, you know what's wrong with it. You ain't even got there yet. I said, your time. I said, your travel time is too much. I said, you're traveling this down that much after you cut your part off. He caught his hair and pulled it and shook his own head. He said, I stood there for 3 days. I never noticed that travel time, which don't mean nothing to a lot of people, but your travel time is when you cut a part off. You don't want it to travel on down like that. Change your table and start cutting the other side. And to save 2 seconds on each piece, making 470 pieces an hour. Count the seconds that they save on both sides, just by moving your limit switch up where it would stop just as you cut through it, stop your machine and shift your table instead of traveling down there. And I saw that before I got to it, this travel time. I had on my machines, and I kept setting them up where when they would cut off, then I'd have the table to shift right away. And he pulled his own hair, and he said, I stood there 3 days. I never noticed that travel time. He told Nyberg, he said, that dang guy saw what was wrong with that machine before he got to it. Nyberg said, what was it? He said, just the travel time. It was traveling too far after it cut the piece. Taking that much more time for it to travel down before your table would shift. All they had to do is put your limit switch up, you know, for when it cut through it would hit the limit switch, that would shift your table. Set your limit switch on both sides. That's all it was to it. 2 minutes. Now little things like that, it was no brains that done it, but it was just that I had worked with it and I could see little things like that the average guy wouldn't see. And I've always run a job, and I've worked for everybody all of my life in a way that this thought come to me when I left home when I was 14. Work for the other man in a way that you would be pleased if he done that for you. So I've always worked for anybody I ever worked for in a way that I would have been pleased if they would have done that work for me. and I've got through the world pretty good. And there at American Motors, they saw I was good with machinery, and that's why they put me on setup. Padley wanted that job on setup, and he had 17 years in there. I had less than 3 years, and they put me on setup. And then I didn't work there too many years till they wanted me to go on salary. But it's just my ability to fix the machines, and I kept my eyes open all the time. But I didn't like the salary job. When they quit that model run and taking me off, they asked me if I wanted to go back, and I told them no, I didn't want that salary job. I got ulcers. I went to the doctor and I went on a strict diet for ulcers for 6 months. I ate just light foods, didn't smoke nothing, didn't drink no whiskey or nothing for 6 months to get rid of them ulcers. But the scars on my stomach now, when they examine my stomach, they say, you've had ulcers. Yeah, I said, I had them pretty bad. And it was that foreman's job that caused me to have ulcers. Nyberg was operated on, Hanson was operated on, Andalusia was operated on. Foreman in the same department. And I didn't want to have that operation. Just worried too much about there's one thing you don't worry about, you don't think about till you get on the job. When you're in a company like that and one department makes so many parts, you make so many parts, them parts goes in that car. Any department in that factory can shut the whole factory down because if you don't make it, and that worried me. And I started doing everything I could to get a float of rods. We went to the meeting one time and the boss telling the guy about the guys that was in the black, you know, the departments in the black and some in the red, you know. And I was in the black, I wasn't caught up, but I had 4 boxes this high. There were 4 in wooden slats on there, and I had 4 of them boxes, over 1,000 rods to the box, float and ready for the line. So right away I held my hand up and, yeah, Mr. Burke, at the meeting, you know, when they called us over to office. I said, how can you determine that I'm in the black when I've got 4 loads of over 4,000 rods ready for the line? He said, good question, Mr. Burke. He said, but the way we count by finished motors. If the motors is finished, that's what we count. And I thought it was a bad way to do it. But he said, it's a good idea. He said, if you've got all that floater rods at the end of the model run, you will be in the black. It wouldn't be in the red, you know. I'd be up to date with my running. But I won't know how he could determine that I was in the red. I meant to say, in the red is when you ain't doing so good, in the danger signal. But I asked him how could he determine me in the danger signal when I had 4,000 rods ready for the line. And he said it was because they counted the motors and not the parts in each department. Yeah, every job I've ever done, I've tried to do it in a way that I would have been pleased if they would do that for me. It's the only way to work.
Any other memories you want to talk about?
Just another thing is being honest. Honesty pays a lot too when you're in a company and you're honest, then the company can trust you. And they trusted me everywhere in the world. They even put me on the 3rd shift to run the 3rd shift without a boss or an inspector. I was setup man, but when they put me on there, I didn't have a boss or an inspector, so I was boss, setup guy, and inspector. And they only put 7 men over there for me to run it a little while till they get a float of rods. Like I was telling you, I had that float of rods. They started making more motors, and they were catching up with it. And they wanted somebody to go on the 3rd shift to make a float of rods to get some ahead. And they kept me in there till I had 17 men. We're running pretty near all the machines in the department. I had 17 people in there. Didn't have no boss, no inspector, because they trusted me. They knew I wouldn't run it if it wasn't right. And the union got after them, said, if you're going to have that many people. He said, that guy can't be boss and inspector and setup guy. Said too much work for him. Says you got too much responsibility on him. They said, well, give us another week and we'll take him off. But 2 weeks later, they take the third shift off. I didn't like that third shift a bit in the world either. Because I couldn't sleep good in the daytime. You worked till 7 o'clock in the morning. I didn't like it at all. And another thing about honesty, like I was now when I was coming from Wisconsin that time, stopped there in Birmingham, and I wanted to get some gas because I didn't want to stop at night, and the sun was almost down. And when I pulled into this little 7-Eleven store, they had a service station there too, you know, but it said, pay for your gas before you pump. So I went in, and I knew $10 would bring me on home from Birmingham because I had some in the tank. So I gave her $10, and I went out and pumped the gas. But you know, when you're pumping the gas, when you get to your $10, it's supposed to shut off. It didn't shut off. And before I could turn it loose and get my hand off, I went 6 cents over the $10. It was $10.06. So I pulled away from the pump where the other guy could get in. He was waiting. I pulled down by the store. And I waited for her to wait on about 4 different guys that was getting bread and milk and stuff like that. And when I got to her, she raised up and looked at me. She said, ain't the machine a-working? I said, in a way it is, in a way it ain't. I said, it pumped the gas, but it didn't shut off, and I went 6 cents over. She said, you could have went on. I wouldn't have never known it. I said, I would have. You ever thought of that? Mm-hmm. That means a lot. If you do harm to somebody, you know it. If they don't know that you done the harm to them, you know it. And that's what I told her. She said, you could have went on. I wouldn't never know it. I said, I would have. The old guy was going out the door and he pushed his screen door back open, looked in, he said, well, there's an honest man in the world. I'd taken that time to go in to pay her that 6 cents. Would you ever think about that?
Yeah, because you raised me.
Yeah, like I said, if they don't know that you done them harm, you do.
Okay, being this is a tape for the kids for Christmas, what were your Christmases like when you were a kid? When you were little?
Well, when we were little, our Christmases was what we made it. We would get out and pick beans or cut people's corn stalks or something, pick cotton to make us a little money for Christmas. We give so much to our stepdad and mother to buy groceries, but we would save us a little for Christmas. And every one Christmas I had $10. And boy, everybody thought I had a lot of money to spend for Christmas. But I made that picking velvet beans and cotton. I was 11 years old, and I had $10 for Christmas. I bought my mother something, I forget what it was, and I bought my stepdad a present, and I gave him an orange and an apple. I bought a dozen oranges, dozen apples, pretty ones too. And I gave my brother some. I bought a lot of firecrackers and things, just regular Christmas stuff. But I spent pretty nearly the whole $10 for Christmas.
Did you buy anything for you?
Well, I bought me a lot of candy and firecrackers. I bought myself more firecrackers to celebrate, you know. I bought some firecrackers 4 inches long, and it was 3 for a dime. And boy, right now they'd cost you 50 cents a piece or more. And I bought me several little packages of little firecrackers to shoot. And Roman candles, you know, shooting. You ever seen them blowing the things out and shake them?
What they do now for the 4th of July, you used to do for Christmas.
The South was always known for fireworks.
And the way we made some of our fireworks, before Christmas we'd take an old sock and unravel it, take the ravels and roll it up like a baseball, you know. And then we would soak it in kerosene for about 3 days before Christmas. And You could see it every house pretty near. You see that fireball going through the air. Some kids down there and they'd catch it and throw it back. These kids over would catch it and throw it back. You'd see them fireballs going for hours out there. And that was mostly our fireworks. It was a ball soaked in kerosene.
How in the world did you throw it back and forth? They have a
Catch
long-
it quick and throw it. You can take hold of a piece of fire with kerosene and take it hold quick and throw it. It won't burn you.
Wow.
You get smutty all over your hand after it starts burning. But we used to, I bet I've seen it, if you would look around at the houses, you could see as high as 10 of them things going at different houses, kids throwing them on the, because that was our regular fireworks, you know.
Did your parents ever buy you anything for Christmas?
Nobody had no money to buy nothing for Christmas. Sometime my dad give us, when I was staying with my dad, he'd buy a dime's worth of candy and give us a few pieces of candy and an apple and an orange. That's about all. If he had enough money, get us some of them little firecrackers, a nickel a package. So, but didn't nobody have any money to buy firecrackers and things and Christmas stuff. Till we got big enough to get out and pick cotton and work ourselves. We'd save us a few dollars for Christmas. And a lot of these other holidays we didn't even notice them. The 4th of July, if it was cotton to hoe or corn to hoe or something like that, we was out there working on the 4th of July, same as well as any other day. So it didn't, the holidays didn't mean much to us poor kids out on the farm. We had to work all the time.
You didn't have any kind of special dinners for Christmas? Did your mom make anything special?
Yeah, my mother would make Christmas dinner. She'd cook a chicken stew or maybe fry some chicken and make a cake and a pie. She always kept dried fruits, and she could make some good pies. And we'd have pies and a cake and maybe chicken for dinner, or maybe a piece of pork roasted. We had it pretty good for Christmas dinner.
What about when you and Mom first got married? Did you have better Christmases then, or would they about the same?
About the same. I was with my dad a lot of the times. We never got none. But when I was with Mama, after I run away from Dad, come to my mom, we had good Christmas dinners.
But my mama, what did you do? You and my mama, did you have good Christmases together?
Well, we had some good Christmases together. You take the second year that we got married, we moved over to Red Level. We cooked our first fruit cake, and I believe that was the best fruit cake I ever eaten in my life. And we made us a fruit cake for Christmas. It lasted about 3 months. It was a big one. And I bought everything that stated it should go in that fruit cake. It was in it. And even put me a bottle of whiskey in it and let it evaporate. And before Christmas, let it evaporate into the cake. It'll give it a better flavor. But we had a good fruit cake. And we made pretty good Christmas dinners for a while. When the money gave out, though, we couldn't do nothing. You know, got to where you couldn't make no money. You ain't gonna save no money at 50 cents a day.
What about when the kids were little? Do you remember any Christmases then, when all of the kids were little?
Well, we would try, but we couldn't give them much. We'd have a few oranges and apples and candy and nuts and stuff. Just let them know Christmas had come around. You know, a few firecrackers and for kids to play with. But it got a little better after we got to Wisconsin, where you could make a little more money. It got a little better, but not too much better. Up there, I went to work at American Motors. When I went up there from Florida for 90 cents an hour. And I was getting rich. I thought I was getting rich at 90 cents an hour. And when they laid us off, when the war was over, I was on the next to the highest paying job at $1.23. $1.23 an hour. And then I worked there 25 years, and I was machine setup man. I got a dime an hour above the top job, and I was making $3.47 when I retired. Now, what could you buy for a bunch of kids making $3 an hour, $3.47 an hour. You can't have a big Christmas. You just got to get what you can afford to get. That's where I say there should be some way that people, of course, I'm all right, I ain't grumbling. But when we had to work for that $3 an hour, and the groceries we bought at that time, we should be able to buy them not too much more right now, but you can't do it. Groceries cost you 4 times more, but we ain't making 4 times what we made then. So it's harder on us now than it was then, at what you make. Because we could buy groceries cheaper now. Now we ain't making much more money in pensions and things, but you got to pay the high price for the groceries. Now, people here talk about years ago when I was little, and we'd go to town if you get some bread. Of course, the bread was 10 cents a loaf. But figure what you made a day, and then figure what you can make a day now. If you pay $1 a loaf, you're getting that bread actually cheaper according to what you make than we was getting it for a dime. Because it was taking us, at 50 cents a day, it was taking us 2 hours labor to buy 1 loaf of bread. And it don't take 2 hours labor now to buy a loaf of bread. Of course, it sounds real cheap at that time. And you take canned goods, you could buy a lot of good big cans of canned vegetables when they did start canning them. Of course, you used to can your own stuff. They didn't have too many canned goods. But you could buy them for 6 cents a can. Good big cans for 6 cents a can. Sounds real cheap. But that was more than an hour a can, just to buy 1 can of food. You had to work more than an hour to buy it. Which it sounds cheap, and it was cheap, but we didn't make it to buy.
How much did you pay for your first car?
First car, I bought me one for $60, an old Chevy, and I cut the body off it after about a year and made me a truck. And then I went to Tampa and I bought me another one for $90. But that was after we got married. My first car that I bought for myself, I guess, was that Model T Ford that I drove from Wisconsin down here. Paid $60 for it. For a 25 Model T convertible.
Paid $60 for it.
$60 for it.
I wish you still had it.
But that was in 29, I guess, or 27. But it was already getting older. And you could go to the store, into the dealership, and buy a brand new one for $460. A brand new one had never been run. But I bought that old one, I only paid $60. I think it was $60 or $68 for it. And I drove that from Wisconsin down here. Drove it around a long time down here. And then I gave it to a guy for a little record player, one of them good big ones like this, and 27 records he had. And he gave me that record player and then 27 records for that Model T Ford.
Were you without a car, or did you have another car by then?
I was fixing to leave here, and I left the record player at George's, I believe. I think it got burned up. And I went back to, well, let's see, where did I go when I left here? 20, that was late in 28 that I sold him, gave him that, brought that thing down in 27. In 28 I let him have it, and then I went back to Wisconsin. Then I went to work at American Motors. Then the next I bought was the Oakland automobile. I drove it back down here. I had that when I got married. It was a big 7-passenger. You let the top back on it like a convertible, but it was a touring car. And everybody said that was a beautiful automobile. The Oakland automobile. I don't even know who made them, but I had a good car. I taken Aunt Burke for a ride on it a couple of times, and me and Bertie used to ride that a lot of times. But it got to where you couldn't buy gas for 'em. You didn't have no money to buy no gas. I let a guy have it to where he could take the engine out and put it on a peanut picker. But I kept buying cars. I went to Florida after I got married, and we bought old Chevrolets and Fords. I'll tell you one I had one time up in Illinois, and I don't even know who made it, a Star. The car, the name of it was a Star. It was a good little car, but it got to where the battery would run down on it all the time. I don't know why it would run down. You could probably live overnight sometime, battery would be down where it wouldn't hardly start. And of course, way back then you had cranks, you could crank them, you know. Well, we had them with the starters on them, and had the crank, and if the starter wouldn't start it, you get the crank and crank it, like old Model T Fords.
Mm-hmm.
We had a Model T Ford when I was real young. My stepdad bought it from old man Helms. I believe it was a 19 Model T Ford, and it had kerosene tail lights. You take it like a lamp, you know. You go back and you pour your kerosene in there, and you start that wick, roll your wick up as high as you want it, make your light as high as you want it for the tail light, put the glass down, and your tail lights on the Model T Ford was kerosene lights.
No flipping the switch and having your lights come on back then, huh?
So, well, your lights, your front lights, was made by your generator running the battery, and as long as your motor was running, you had a light. But turn your motor off, you didn't have no lights. They made by a magneto in the thing, and it was called magneto lights. It was like a, I don't know what you would call it, like a magnet, and the magnets were put about this far apart, and then you had your little point in there, and when this was turning on that point, or close to it, you know, like a spark plug, it would create a spark, and there was a wire went from this magneto thing to your coils on the side of the car, little wooden coils about that big, and they worked up and down like this, and that caused your spark for your spark plug. But you didn't have no battery on it. You started with a crank, you run it without any electric lights. It was magneto lights. This magneto, that stuff made your lights.
When did you buy your very first brand new car that nobody had ever driven before?
Well, that one I bought up there in Illinois, I had to let it go about 3 months later in 29. But my brand new car that I bought and kept
Just go, Jared. Just go.
was a Nash, one American Motors cars, a classic, a 46. We didn't make no 45s, that was during the war. And when the 46s first come out, I got one of them. Pay Lightner got his on Thursday, and I got mine Friday afternoon.
Pick
We
out
got them right just a day apart, me and the superintendent.
You gotta pick out the color and everything that you wanted brand new, huh?
Pick out the color brand new. And I picked out and ordered it, you know, from the guy. I showed him what I wanted and ordered it because right then it wasn't too easy to get them right after the war. Everybody wanted them, you know. It wasn't too easy to get them. And I bought that car, and then you couldn't charge too much at the dealership for a car. So I wanted that Ambassador, and I was going to trade that Classic in, the 46, to get me that 48 Ambassador, and only paid $400 difference, where the Ambassador would have cost you $600 more than the other one to start with. But they could sell a used car for a higher price, but there was government regulation on the new car, and they couldn't charge too much for it. So they traded me that new Ambassador for that 46 Classic. 2 years I'd been driving for $400 trade-in.
Wow, what a deal, huh?
I got that Ambassador, and then from then on I'd buy a new one about every 2 to 4 years. And then Eddie and all of them learned how to drive cars. All of his buddies learned how to drive cars. By that old Ambassador, I let them have it, left it down in the field, and let them drive it. But I had 128,000 miles on that thing. That was a good car, and then them kids learned how to drive it. I bought that 55, no, I bought another one before that. Then I bought that 55, was the first V8, no, it wasn't, it was a 53. It was the first V8 I ever bought. And that was that little classic. And that's the one that they told me about Eddie had beating everybody on the track with that.
63? Was it 63? That black one?
63. Yeah, 63. And Eddie beat everybody on the track with that. But I had about 5 new ones before I got that one. Before I got that, I think I had that classic that I got hit up in Milwaukee. And they tried to fix it, but always wore the tires that didn't run good, it made a noise, and I traded that in. I think that's when I traded that one in and got that classic 63. And then I don't even know what the next I bought. Yeah, that yellow one, they call it the
taxi cab.
taxi cab, yeah.
Rebel.
Yeah, that Rebel. Sold that to Leroy and said it's the best car he ever had, and I had 122,000 miles on it. And then I bought that that one I let Ruth have. What was that?
Green.
Green one. And then I bought another one. You know, I can't think now of the cars that I bought. Even up there, when I bought one, I had a Buick, and I kept that Buick even after I bought the other car. I kept it quite a while. Some guy wanted it, and I sold. That was a 53 Buick, but it was later in the time when I didn't buy it new. It was about 3 or 4 years old. But I drove that Buick down here a couple of times. You know, when I had that thing was 55. Because when I went on salary, the guys would yell at me, "Get that thing out of here." I was boss, you know, and I could drive in the plant, in the yard, at the plant, and I was driving that Buick in there. They'd yell at me, "Get that thing out of here." But your boss, you know, whatever you got, you go in the yard and park up in the yard. Didn't have to hunt a parking place. They yelled at me. That's why I remember it was in 55, because 55 is when I went on salary, 55 and 56, and I had that Buick at that time. They said, "Get that Buick out of this yard." Actually, was supposed to have American Motors car department there, but just a lot of them didn't have them, you know. Make a guy a foreman, whatever he's got, that's what he drives in there. Oh, well. A lot of things happen in my life that I don't know just when it happened or how it happened, but we pulled through anyway.